Start. Everybody's returned from lunch, I guess. So, at the beginning, I have some news to share, which are, on the one hand, a little bit sad, but on the other, there are some advantages to it. Namely, that our third panelist, Laura Herza, is not going to join us due to family emergency. So it's just us, or rather the two of you. But we will have a lot of time for discussion. So please try to think intensely about the questions that you might have, and all sorts of ideas that are going to be stirred by this talk. All right. So without further ado, let's proceed in the order of the program. And I'm proud to give the floor to Professor Katarzyna Zielińska from the Institute of Sociology of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Kasia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So I would also like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event. This has been really nice, very inspiring, lots of interesting discussions. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And I also, in a way, have a sad news for all of you, because I'll be again talking about Poland, and I think you've heard already quite a lot about the illiberalism or illiberal transition in Poland. So I will add to that. Maybe to my defense, I'll be speaking more from the perspective of a sociologist, because I'm a sociologist, not a political scientist. And also I will be trying to look at the illiberal transformation in Poland from the gendered perspective. I would like to, basically my idea was to look at the sexual politics of the United Right and to try to reflect on what do these politics tell us about the illiberalism. So this is my agenda in a way for today's speech. So if we start with some of the definitions regarding what accounts for illiberal democracy. So Farid Zakaria is stressing that basically illiberal democracy is a regime which would be combining some democratic procedures, for example, multi-party system and general elections, but at the same time, it will be the system or regime which disregards some constitutional limits to power, and often they will be lacking the protection of citizens' individual rights. Jan Kubik, on the other hand, he stresses, along with the similar lines, he stresses that basically illiberal democracy is based on the three corresponding, in a way, principles. So it would be populism, that the formation, the political parties or parties in power will be basically exercising this populist rhetorics or style, as Adam was mentioning earlier in his presentation, which will be very much justifying a lot of decisions by reference to the will of the people. So, for example, the need to limit, for example, the certain institutions would be justified by the references to the will of the people and the need to protect or to pursue the will of the people. The second principle which Kubik stresses is anti-pluralism, or organizational anti-pluralism. So it's basically the underlying perception or argument that the political adversaries, they claims or they position or they standpoints are not necessarily legitimate, because obviously they do not represent the will of the people. And the third principle, which Kubik stresses, is ideological monism. So basically, illiberal democracies are based on the assumption that plurality and tolerance, this is something which is basically a threat to the real substance of the nation, of the people, and that substance needs to be protected. And of course, lots of the regimes in power usually place themselves in the position of those who are responsible for this protection. So if we observe what has been going on in Poland since 2015, we would see that actually lots of processes would fit these definitions. So, of course, we've been observing, and we heard already about this in other presentations, how basically over the last 7 years the checks and balances system in Poland has been slowly dismantling. So basically, Parliament right now plays the role mostly of a kind of voting machine, which is legitimizing mostly the government's decisions, the ruling majority decisions. The judicial reforms and reform of the Constitutional Court, of course, aimed at kind of, controlling in a way, or transforming or subordinating the judicial power to the power of the executive. And we clearly see this dominance of the executive in Poland. Another process which has been already well documented by the researchers is also what could be called the civil society replacement, that basically the policies of the Law and Justice, the United Right, was aiming at promoting and supporting those civil society organizations which would be very much kind of supporting their agenda and very much promoting the conservative values, and at the same time regulating or making it more problematic for the civil society organizations which support foreign or different agendas, to make their operation much more problematic. So this has been done mostly by the financing, that the kind of financing system was redefined in order to support the right civil society organizations, the ones which will be promoting the right values, including also lots of Catholic organizations, and deprive of financing the organizations which, for example, were working to support women's rights or LGBTQ groups, or more generally minority rights. Another aspect of this illiberal turn was taking control of mass media, so it was centralization, but also very much replacing or putting the right people in the positions of ruling or managing the media. The ideological turn, as various research also shows, has also this ideological dimension. So we have a very strong nationalistic sentiment being promoted by the ruling majority, and the main characteristics of this nationalist sentiment would be based on the promotion of homogeneity, and of course horizontal othering, the construction of us, good Poles, Catholics, as the real people, and them, and these others I will tell a bit more about in a minute. In Catholicism, someone asked in the previous session about the role of religion. So yes, in Poland, the illiberal turn. In this illiberal turn, I would say the church is very much supporting the turn, but also offering the kind of the Catholicism serves as a sort of symbolic glue for constructing these united homogeneous people. And there is, of course, as I mentioned, populist style, which very much stresses the horizontal, vertical othering. Therefore, the ruling majority stresses very much the elites versus the people, and of course, because they represent the people, they have the right to rule. And of course, in this populist style and the populist rhetorics, the EU was also, we had this discussion a bit earlier, the EU plays a very important role, because the EU is very often considered as ruled by the European elites who do not understand the normal people. So basically, these normal Polish people need to be protected against these influences from external foreign influences. So for me, it was interesting because, of course, what was also this illiberal turn, which I just discussed, was also another important feature is also the sexual politics, which the government was pursuing. So I was interested to look into this sexual politics, and to, as I said earlier, reflect on what they tell us about the illiberal turn. So which sexual politics do I have in mind, and what was important? For me, interesting was to look at the justifications offered. I mean, what was the kind of legitimization of these politics? What sort of arguments served as a justification for implementing these politics? So, first of all, this was the United Rights from 2015 up to now. We have seen lots of actions or decisions or turns which aimed at limiting the women's rights. Yeah, so probably, I assume a lot of you could hear about the so-called black protests or women's strikes, which took part in Poland in 2016, and then there was a subsequent protests happening also when the government was again trying to tighten the abortion law. So it happened first in 2016 when the ruling majority, the United Right, supported the bill which was proposing total ban on abortion, also including the putting women who had abortion into prison threat. So the coalition supported the bill to go through the first reading in the parliament, and then was sent to the commission, and then only in a kind of in response to the mass protests which took place in 2016, the government gave up on the idea of proceeding and actually pursuing this law. However, because Law and Justice United Right is very much gains a lot from the support, gains a lot of support from the conservative civil society organizations, also from the Catholic Church, they in a way owned these organizations something in return. Yeah, so instead of pursuing the trying to again ban abortion or limit access to abortion through the parliament, they decided to use the Constitutional Court. And in 2020, the Constitutional Court, which is already controlled, as we heard in the yesterday's session, it's controlled by well, it's under the influence of the government. The judges who are sitting there have been very much kind of chosen along the party, I guess, connections, if I can say so. Maybe it's too strong to say so, but anyway, definitely influenced by the executive. So the court declared that the most frequent grounds for legal abortion, that would be fetal life, limiting fetal anomaly, as unconstitutional, which in practice outlawed abortion in Poland. So this is one of the serious. This is considered as a serious limitation of the reproductive rights and the rights of women. And if we look at the arguments behind this, the implementing of these policies, what is interesting is to see that basically the arguments were very much based on the language of human rights. So the politicians and also civil society, these conservative civil society organizations, they will be claiming that basically we need to ban abortion or limit access to abortion because this is violation of right to life. This is discrimination of children with disabilities, and therefore this is why we need to limit this condition, which was declared by Constitutional Court as unconstitutional. And we also need to protect women's rights, because women are, for example, forced to have abortion, or they don't have enough of a support. So therefore, to protect these women from the potential problems resulting from having abortions, we should actually ban or limit access to abortion. Another set of arguments which were behind the introduction of these, which were another set of justifications which were used in case of abortion politics, it was related to the more, I would say, community-related arguments. So it was about preserving culture and future of the nation. So the argument would be, we need to limit abortion, access to abortion, because this is about the future of the Polish nation. If we allow women to have abortions, therefore the nation in future will be endangered. Another important issue which was happening more recently, it was the declaration from the Ministry of justice that Poland basically should withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. And here the argumentation was also very interesting. The convention, basically he argued that the convention does not respect religion and promotes gender ideology. So basically it also opposes parents' rights to raise children in accordance to their moral and religious views. And of course, it is also representing the foreign values, and these foreign values would be considered as the, for example, the values which are imposed on us by the liberal Europe. Another case which was very important, there was the politics which were aiming at limiting the rights of the LGBTQ plus communities, people in Poland. So the most, I guess, controversial issue was the introduction of the attempt, and in fact introduction in many places, of the LGBT ideology-free zones, so-called. So the local declaration, the local towns, the small towns or municipalities, especially in this part of Poland, which were supporting law and justice, so United Right, they declared they areas as free from LGBT ideology. And again, the justification was very interesting because it would be stressing that these areas need to be freed from LGBT ideology, because this implies, or this is required in order to protect the traditional family, to combat sexualization of children, but also because the promotion of LGBT ideology means that the rights of the heterosexual majority is threatened. And of course, because the nation and its culture needs to be protected against the external threats. And again, the EU would be considered as the institution which is somehow promoting and supporting the rights of LGBTQ communities. More recent example would be the initiative, again, this is a citizens' initiative, which is called Stop LGBT. This was the bill which was supported again in the first reading in the parliament by the United Right. And again, justification will be here referring to the family, to the protection of children. And again, it would be about the argument about the need to protect against the ideologies coming from the outside. So what does it tell us, these arguments and these policies which were introduced, which were attempted to be introduced by the United Right, what can they tell us about the, I don't know, nature of this illiberal turn? So it seems to that from the analysis of these arguments, and also from the kind of, the discussions around these when these politics were being discussed and proceeded, for example, in the parliament, it becomes quite clear that the liberal equality paradigm is constructed as a main problem against which, in opposition to which, the illiberal alternative is being constructed. So gender ideology basically gains this role, or takes the role of the enemy figure, which represents liberal agenda against which basically the real Polish people need to be protected, of course, by the ruling coalition. Gender and LGBT ideology is also used to articulate this horizontal and vertical othering. So, as I was giving the examples, the EU is very often considered as the one which is imposing the foreign values, and it poses a threat and a danger to the nation. But at the same time, for example, LGBTQ people are considered as those who do not belong to this category of real people of the nation. So, of course, this vertical and horizontal othering plays a very important role in consolidating the people Yeah, so this is in a way promoting the ideological monism. This anti-gender and heteronormative family mainstreaming, they basically serve as pillars for building illiberal nation states. And of course, I'm talking about Poland, but the very similar processes, mechanisms we are seeing, for example, in Hungary. Especially Hungary is a kind of a good example, and the very similar processes are taking place over there. What is also interesting, these sexual policies are also showing that there is a redefinition of security, equality, and human rights at the grounds of these politics. So gender ideology is treated as a threat to security, existential survival of the nation. Yeah. So our main threat is basically gender ideology. Yeah, and therefore again, I was stressing these foreign values and external enemies. Again, the EU very often in this discourse, in these narratives, is presented as the threat to Poland, to its kind of sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, which needs to be protected. And what is also there, that these are minorities which need to be majorities which need to be protected from the aggressive minorities. So to conclude, what does it tell us about the illiberal democracy, or what sort of questions it opens? So basically, clearly the sexual policies which were introduced or which are being supported by United Right, they actually imply the limitation of citizenship for the certain groups. So, and there were, as I was saying, I was presenting there were some attempts to institutionalize inequality, especially these LGBT-free, ideology-free zones. Yeah, this would be a good example how this inequality was being institutionalized. And of course, we can say that this is just this particular group, but of course the question is maybe this is the first group which was kind of target, yeah. And the question is, of course, who will be target as the enemy in the second round. Then we have prioritization of community over individual rights, so which is very much linked with the nationalistic agenda of the United Right, and more generally with this illiberal turn. And in the previous session, we were talking about, there was this message saying that we need to be careful about to have the community values, I think, yeah, and not only individual values. And I was already immediately thinking, yes, but of course there's also a danger of prioritizing the community over individual, and this is also problematic potentially, as these cases which I described may show. And what is probably the most interesting to me, this is this appropriation of liberal concepts. So we had these liberal arguments which are basically used to justify illiberal purposes, and this is something which maybe which needs to be reflected more upon, because we still speak about human rights, yeah, but the understanding of the kind of meaning which is behind this concept of human rights may be very, very different depending who is speaking and for what purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we pass to our second panelist, Professor Christopher Coker, the director of the LSE Ideas. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a somewhat broader philosophical approach and also a global range, rather than looking specifically at Europe. And I'm going to be very gloomy. The British novelist Martin Amis writes, there's an intellectual glamour to doom, which undoubtedly there is. His father was even gloomier than he is, Kingsley Amis. I don't know whether you know, they're both famous novelists. Kingsley Amis said that in London you get invited to each other's clubs for lunch, usually. And the average club lunch is that you have at least a couple of drinks at the bar, then you go up to the restaurant and you have a wonderful a la carte lunch, usually 4 courses and at least 2 bottles of wine. And then you come back to the bar for a couple of glasses of brandy, and then you go back to the office. It's a very, of course, civilized way of conducting life. Kingsley said that the 3 most gloomiest questions in the English language from his host when he visited his club was, first, should we go straight up? Second was, you know, that they do a wonderful table d'hôte here. And the third and most depressing question of all was, I think we might manage a glass, don't you? Anyway, I'm not going to be that gloomy. And we have had a very good lunch, and I noticed that I have been given some plinka, which is the local brew, the plum brandy. So I really do recommend you have this. I'm not going to drink it entirely myself, so I'll try to do justice to it. I'm in a sharing mood today, which is normally not the case. Okay, well, there's not much to be optimistic about when it comes to human rights, and I shall be specifically talking about human rights because a post-Western world looms, which may very well turn out to be a post-liberal one. And for 2 centuries, the influence of liberal ideas, whether we like to acknowledge the fact or not, has been tied to the predominance of Western power, and that power is now fast ebbing in the world. Attempts to foster human rights, for example, in Afghanistan, we gave it 20 years, signal failure. In Libya, we failed within months in Libya. These attempts have failed decisively, and as one non-Western critic argued in a very well-received book a couple of years ago, the world's discontented no longer have much faith in the vision of a gradual progress under liberal democratic trustees. Those trustees, of course, include the United States, that arguably hasn't had a clue what it's been doing in the last 25 years and may have done more damage than good. And even at home, as we just heard, the West finds itself having to defend the essentials of liberalism in the face of nationalist and populist forces. So there are now books appearing, one indeed from the professor of human rights in my own institution, the LSE, a couple of years ago, called The End of Human Rights. There wasn't even a question mark in the title. So at this point in history, I think we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. And what I want to do this afternoon is to ask 2 fundamental questions. Question 1, are human rights rooted in biology, as liberalism suggests, or is it in culture, as conservative liberals like myself would suggest? We think culture, in terms of human rights, is much more important than biology, because we can't find any evidence that we are born, human beings are born with a moral grammar wired into our neural circuits by natural selection that operates in the same way that Noam Chomsky's universal grammar operates. Not Noam Chomsky, back in the 50s, said that we have an innate neural machinery to speak. We are born, Homo sapiens is born with a neural machinery for language, which is why we're the only species on the planet that actually has a conversation with itself. There is no universal moral grammar. And that's for the principal reason that life is very normative. So societies have murdered in the name of God. They've committed acts of genocide. They've practiced child sacrifice. They've traded in slaves. They've killed their own children for family honor. Not because they're biologically programmed to do any of this, but because culture demanded it. So when we compare ourselves with ISIS, for example, we share the biological DNA of members of ISIS, but we don't share their cultural DNA. My second question is, does history matter? And I think history matters very much. The human rights agenda, as we understand it today, is a product of the 18th century European Enlightenment, and it's a product particularly of the French Revolution and its founding doctrine, the very first document that the French revolutionaries produced, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Man, full title of which, by the way, which we ignore very foolishly, is the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, because the French revolutionaries believed only citizens had rights, not subjects. Now, of course, you can argue, and many will, that human rights is also grounded, in the West at least, in Judeo-Christian ideas, but I actually think that the 18th century Enlightenment and the French Revolution is the key to all of this. And the philosopher John Dewey insisted that ethics cannot be reduced to a single principle, such as empathy for the fate of other human beings. It has to be grounded and is grounded in what people think is important at the time. In other words, it's grounded in history. And historically, over time, societies change their idea of what is a human right. What's been very interesting, I think, in the Western world since the 1960s is that we have what Peter Berger calls liberalism, a contempt for cruelty. And the cruelty that we've identified now since the 60s is behind closed doors. The cruelty in homes, cruelty to women and children in the home, the cruelty to prisoners, the cruelty to people who are institutionalized. These are the things that in Western Europe have been of great interest to governments, liberal governments, in the last 40 years. I mean, take rape in marriage, for example. As older practice as marriage itself only became a crime in my country in 1962. So people knew about it, they didn't talk about it, and they certainly didn't legislate against it. Still continues, of course. What we think is good is historically grounded. And what we're seeing now with Russia and China is a pushback against a Western understanding of what is good. So Chinese academics are told by the state that they must discussing with their students certain subjects. I'll name three: universal values, with the emphasis on universal; citizen rights, with the emphasis on rights; and the rule of law, as it is understood by Western constitutional lawyers. On what understanding? On the understanding that these are un-Chinese. Secondly, the Chinese argue that history matters, hence the return to Confucianism, and that Confucian values are now being revived to reconnect children who are taught them to such Confucian concepts as loyalty, particularly to the ancestors. That means the people who run the country as well. Consideration for others, social values rather than individual values, rather than the kind of me culture, and righteousness, whatever righteousness may mean. And there's even a new subject in Chinese universities called Chinese studies. And Chinese studies are an alternative to Western social science. And they represent fundamental attempt to recover a distinctive Chinese way of knowing that was sidelined, it is argued, by Enlightenment European thinking. And we have such arguments in our own societies: decoloniality and the de-Westernization of thought. Because, of course, there is also an attack on the European Enlightenment in our own schools and our own universities. Now, let me take just two specific examples of what's happening out there in the challenge to human rights. First is the challenge to universality. So no one is questioning, certainly officially in China, or even to some extent in Moscow, that people have rights. But what they are saying is that Russian rights are different from Chinese rights, and both of those rights are different from everybody else's rights. You have a right to your own rights. I think that there is no challenge in China or Russia to Marx's idea of species being, that we all are biological and feel pain, whatever our cultural or historical DNA. They're not challenging that fact at all. But what they're saying is that there is no value universality now. There is value pluralism, and everyone should respect each other's values. It's interesting that in a speech Putin gave yesterday, I noticed on the news today, he said that the fundamental principle now of Russian foreign policy is to export Russian ideals. And not Russian ideas, because Putin's Russia doesn't have ideas. Ideas are ideologies. He repudiates communism on the basis that they had the wrong ideas, but Russian ideals, which go back 1,000 years to the origins of the Russian people and Russian society. Every civilization, therefore, if it has its own rights, will chart its own path into the future. And we have no right to criticize or critique what they are doing, because we have no historical basis for criticizing other societies. And I think what you're seeing in Russia is a society which is retreating from Europe, which is becoming something of a European outcast, which is very significant because Russia has spent the last 250 years trying to be European and to be part of the European community. Remember Gorbachev's Common European House? Absolutely important for Gorbachev's reform of communism. And now we will find, I think, a society that is no longer has any wish to be European, certainly not to be judged by Europeans. And it will become a kind of fossil fuel dependent regional power, trying to maintain some idea of Russianness, if it can, between Europe and China. Good luck to it. My second example is a very West European one. It's especially challenging, I think, for France. So back to 1789 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Its full title, as I said, is The Rights of Man and the Citizen. This very revolutionary idea that rights are an invention. We were not born with these rights, contrary to what the American revolutionaries said. We assert these rights. It's part of the dignity of being human that we demand these rights for ourselves, but we can only have those rights and invent them in a political context. There are no rights outside the state. And therefore, when the subject is replaced by the citizen, when the king himself becomes a citizen, if the king is lucky enough to survive, then you can start to assert these rights that you claim for yourself. So it's a highly political concept. And it's caught on, and it's, I think, just general currency. Now, this becomes difficult if you have a minority, and it is still a minority in France, that has a different understanding of values, and particularly the importance of religion in the life of that community. The French state embraces the concept of laïcité, which means that there is an absolute distinction between church and state. But this is a problem, of course, for people who don't want necessarily such a distinction and believe that the problem with Western human rights is that they are highly secular. Even the secular assertion of religious tolerance can in itself be seen as rather offensive. And this brings me back to biology, because when I said that human rights are in our cultural DNA, I wasn't dismissing biology, by the way. I'm bringing biology back into the conversation. Religion has biological origins. And that's extremely important, something that the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, who should know this because he is a biologist, refuse to accept. But most of the recent writing on the biological origins of religion in the last 25 years, I think, is very convincing. Many scientists now tell us that religion is a fundamental biological reality of cooperation, of social cooperation. And when people are primed with God-related words like sacred and divine, they become more pro-social. Religious people have more children than atheists. If you go to Utah, which is the home of Mormonism, 90%, 100 years ago, of people who lived in Utah were Mormons. Today, the population is about 12%. Mormons still have the same percentage of the population in Utah as they had 90 years ago in terms of religious faith, because children are born in a religious community. The nation state was once sacred. Remember that. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the nation state was what was sacred. Religion wasn't important. Patriotism was everything. And when the French were fighting the Battle of Verdun, those 300,000 people who died in Verdun in those months in 1916, the road that allowed the French army to be reinforced enabled it to actually survive and then win, whatever winning meant in 1916, was called the Voie Sacrée, the sacred road. Today, there's no one in Western Europe who would be willing to die for their country. Patriotism is now materialistic. It's not sacred. But religion is still sacred, and sacred values for many people are to be found in the religious experience. Another scientific interest, which I think is important, neuroimaging. If you look at neuroimaging, this provides evidence that we process sacred values in those parts of the brain that are devoted to rule-bound behavior, not to utilitarian calculation. This is a problem for liberalism, because liberalism is based on cost-benefit analysis. What is good for you? Benthamite utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. That is a liberal predisposition for the empirical valuation of costs and consequences. Now, this is why so many people are dismissive of religion, of liberalism from a religious perspective, because it is utilitarian, it's materialistic, it's lacking in sacred value. So if you have part of your population that finds liberalism extremely unappealing, don't be surprised, because in fact we're all biologically primed to want to find the sacred in our life. So therefore, I think we're faced in the West with two prospects. And this is where the gloom comes in. The first is that somehow, over the next few years, we can build a new world order, less liberal. We must stop talking about the liberal rules-based order, because only Westerners talk about this. It means nothing to most of the rest of the world. And find some consensus on what we should be doing. I think we can find a consensus by identifying human wrongs rather than asserting human rights. It's easier for people to agree that certain behavior is wrong than to actually tell them that they must behave in a particular way because it's the right thing to do. The second question, or second prospect, is that we liberals will have to accept that liberalism has, and human rights, has very little appeal outside our own world, and just live with that reality. So I'm going to end with the late American philosopher Richard Rorty, who made this point. He said, look, he was nearing the end of his life at this point. He said, and he was a great critic, of course, of liberal practices, but not of liberalism as such. He said, I actually do believe at the end of my life that liberalism is the most successful form, the most successful ideology that's ever been invented. And I think it provides the happiest life for human beings. But that is my understanding as a Westerner. Of course, I would probably believe that. But that's because it's based on my own historical experience, and it's based on my own cultural understanding of value. Am I to expect the next 3 billion people who are coming into the world today to embrace the world of John Stuart Mill and Condorcet? And if they reject that world as being of no interest or value to themselves, what do we do? Well, he said we should be like St. Augustine, who was mentioned at the Pessimism Conference several times, who watched the Western Roman Empire decline and decay as we are watching the Western world decline and decay. But he didn't give up on his belief in Christianity. He actually said Christianity was the great solace for people who watched the world declining and decaying. And you can find comfort in that historical analogy or not, as you like. I could take as a question, ask you how many people would be happy to take this Augustinian position as our world crumbles around us. Well, I won't ask you. And I'll just have a drink. Thank you.
Thank you. Undoubtedly, that was a very well-deserved drink.
Thank you.
All right, so given that we've got a lot of time, I suggest we proceed this way. That first of all, I would like to ask individual questions to our panelists. Then I will ask a more general one to both panelists. And then I will give the floor to the audience. So if you can already prepare your minds for questions to our distinguished panelists, that would be most welcome. So I would like to begin with a question to Kasia's presentation. And I would like to ask you about a kind of a broader context of this sexual politics of liberalism that you have described in Poland. Namely, And this question can go both ways. First of all, we can see that in a number of countries of the world, we see similar tendencies. And of course, in this sense, Polish liberalism is, to a certain degree at least, part of what's going on in the US with Trumpism and with the overturn of Roe versus Wade. And on the other hand, we see Russia being also quite an aggressive promoter of Russian ideals, as you said. Of course, the question could be, first of all, how do you put the Polish liberalism on this international map? But the second leg of this question is even broader, because when we look historically at the 20th century, different forms of fascism or authoritarianism, they were obsessed about sexuality, the control of reproduction, the control of pleasure, most importantly. And we've got a number of excellent analyses from Erich Fromm through Jacques Lacan up to Slavoj Žižek about why was fascism precisely focused on that. So to which extent do you think that this current version of sexual politics, of illiberalism, can be somehow inscribed in this diagnosis of the sexual obsession, the obsession about the pleasure that goes hand in hand with fascism, and we can see that in a number of symptoms?
Thank you for both questions. So regarding the broader context, I would say, and I mentioned this during the presentation, that very similar developments are being observed in different countries. Yeah, of course, Poland and Hungary, I think Hungary is particularly close in the kind of policies developed, and Poland is in a way following, not only in the field of sexual politics, but also in other developments. So definitely in these two countries, you can see lots of similarities, and putting it even in the broader context of Russia and the kind of conservative mobilization and selling it abroad or promoting it as saving the real proper life and defending it against the influences from the West. This is something which Polish developments, Polish liberalism is very much, I would say, in line with. And there are actually research showing very much how especially civil society organizations, how there are lots of transnational links between the organizations functioning in different parts of the world. So this is also South America, US and Russia, but also lots of far right groups operating, parties operating in the Western European countries. So in Poland and Hungary, the situation is slightly different because the right-wing parties, populist right-wing parties, are actually in power. Yeah, but when I was discussing this LGBT-free, the Stop LGBT bill, this was very much, this was resembling very much the law which Putin introduced back in, I know it was about a decade ago, when he was also stressing how we need to protect Russian society from the sexualization and so on. So there is a kind of a global links and global mobilization, which has very much this sexual, the special understanding of sexuality or sexual politics at the center of its activities. And yes, it links very well with the second question. Yes, I think this is the obsession, but also this is the obsession which shows very much the need to control. This is like domination and control on the individuals. And here is the problem, that maybe this obsession with sexuality, this is actually the obsession with the ability to control, to the kind of control and manage the body. Yeah, this is of course also goes to the concept of biopolitics when managing the bodies of the population, but also humans. And I think this is at the very, very center of lots of illiberal fascist regimes, where this need to control the body is actually a sign of extending the control.
Thank you very much. Christopher, your kind of your vibe of gloomy Spenglerism somehow caught my interest, and the constructive side of my nature produced a question to you on this. Because you were trying to, as far as I reconstructed your argument, trying to present human rights as a kind of historical contingence of the West. And of course, I very much agree with that. But the trouble is, to which extent is it truly the historical contingence spanning from the Enlightenment? And to which extent, perhaps, this is a kind of development that happened after the Second World War? There is an influential book by Samuel Moyn, who once claimed that human rights, even though we try to credit them to the 18th century, and we try to, this is what I do myself with my students, I always tell them that this is precisely when human rights began. But then, of course, we look at the history of the 20th century, we see the developments after the Second World War. We can see Hannah Arendt's argument that basically human rights were born only after civic rights collapsed during the Second World War. And when seen in that light, the current developments wouldn't be perhaps that gloomy. So it's not the end of an epoch that has been spanning over 2 centuries, but the end of an epoch that was the period of happy liberalism, also very much connected with the fall of the Iron Curtain and the triumph of liberalism over the entire world. So it's just like a minor cycle of 50, 60 years, perhaps. And we were just trying to retroactively project this period on previous times of history, and we were trying to legitimize it by saying, well, in our years, we continue what began in the Enlightenment. But perhaps this is, just a much smaller wave on the beach of history. What do you think?
Well, there's very challenging questions, and I'm glad you mentioned Spengler, because we had a pessimism conference just before this one, and last year we had another pessimism conference, and my paper was on Spengler. I was trying to rescue his reputation somehow. It's a very dangerous thing to try to do. I agree with you in many respects that there has been extraordinary. We don't send children. Well, most of us don't send children into mines, for example, any longer. Most of us, well, let's just take the slave trade, because that's very interesting. According to the United Nations, there are more slaves in the world today than at any other time in human history. So what we've done is that we've merely changed the slave trade. For example, sex trafficking wasn't huge in the 19th century, or it definitely existed, but not on the scale it does today, which is truly global. It's a huge business for transnational organized crime. It's interesting that when Theresa May was Home Secretary, in my country, she introduced an anti-slavery bill. First time ever that Britain had had an anti-slavery bill. Slavery is persistent and changes historically in form. And if opportunities are presented to enslave people, that is, in other words, to reduce them to a servile status and to make them do what you want them to do, those opportunities are still being seized, and we're not doing very much about them. We don't have slave markets. ISIS had slave markets. Boko Haram had slave markets. You can actually go to the market and buy a slave. That doesn't happen because transnational organized crime isn't stupid enough to have slave markets in that sense. Those would soon be closed down. But everything is done in the shadow economy. I agree with you that there are more rights in one sense than there have been before. But I would actually change this and say there are fewer wrongs than there have been. And this is a distinction made by the philosopher Mary Midgley, who died quite recently in one of her books, to say that we have been, non-Western societies have been addressing human wrongs for a very long time. But they have not addressed those wrongs in the language of rights necessarily. So her favorite example was what was called the crossroads cut. In 17th century Japan, if a samurai warrior found himself at a crossroads with a peasant, he was entitled to improve his sword technique by decapitating the peasant. This was legally enshrined. It was the right. It wasn't murder. In the 18th century, it was decided that perhaps that shouldn't be allowed. So they were allowed to go into prisons and improve their sword techniques by decapitating prisoners, only prisoners on death row, however, not normal prisoners. And in the 19th century, it was decided there was a very bad practice anyway. So anyway, by the 19th century, the samurai had effectively were about to become industrialists and capitalists and didn't need their sword technique any longer. But she was saying that Japan had a long discussion about what was wrong. And not a discussion about whether peasants had a right not to have their heads chopped off by the samurai, who after all was the most important people in Japanese society well into the mid-19th century, at least formally. So I think we have been addressing wrongs. The Chinese government addresses many wrongs. I'm not sure about Putin, but the language of rights, which is a very European Enlightenment language, French Revolutionary language, is a language that we're going to have difficulty, I think, asserting.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask a question to both panelists at the same time. So at least one thing that you've got in common in your presentations is a vision of historical change, or the return perhaps of the past that for a long time has seemed to be gone, but right now it rears its ugly head. So quite naturally, what comes into mind when you think about this sort of historical change is whether this is a kind of a historical hiccup that we are going to overcome, like the return of illiberal sexual politics, or the current decline of historical of human rights, or perhaps is it truly an end of an era and end of an eon, bringing about some kind of great historical changes. And with this question in mind, I'm thinking about Ernst Bloch, a German Jewish philosopher, who in the interwar period coined the term Ungleichzeitigkeit der Gleichzeitigen, meaning the uncontemporaneous of the contemporaneous. What he was trying to say by this very complicated formula, I admit, is that within one society, which seems to be modern, we have actually a patchwork of different societies. We have areas which are up to date, which are very modern, which are developing, and we have others that seem reactionary, that seem almost medieval, and they coexist. And it's a normal state of in modernity. So perhaps isn't it precisely like this today, that we have areas in which the development of human rights or progressivism is very high, and we have the exploration of further boundaries of gender identity, for example, at least for two decades. And we have areas in which we have like the proper reaction to that. But maybe this is just, the some kind of liminal period that is not necessarily that gloomy as you described. So I was wondering what you think about that.
I think this is a very good point. I'm a sociologist, so I'm not very good at that. I'm always scared of predictions. Yeah, I need to have some empirical data to predict, but I do actually, because I think this concept of the patchwork of societies. This I think would be very well describing at least Poland. I don't know so much about, but I guess in Hungary and probably in other countries you would also witness that. So I would say wherever the sociological research also shows very clearly that whenever you have the dominance, there is always a resistance. Yeah. So of course, when there is this particular government in power is pursuing and promoting the certain visions, certain sexual politics, there is of course lots of resistance towards that as well. And this resistance also means that the other civil society organizations are trying to, for example, organize the network of support for women who are willing, who are looking for the help. And there is also the various organizations and network of people who will be supporting those who are particularly, who will be also challenging, for example, the government agenda regarding LGBTQ rights. So I would definitely agree that there is this patchwork. The question is who would win or who would be the next in the row. This is a question which is difficult, because I think in case of Poland, it also very much depends on on who will win the next elections. But let's also remember that I have a feeling sometimes that whereas the Polish society is kind of liberalizing in terms of, and I'm talking about the kind of social liberalism, yeah, the way they approach the way they perceive the sexuality, the rights of the sexual minorities, women's rights. There is more and more support. Yeah, majority would be supporting this, but the politicians are kind of somehow behind. Yeah, so there is a different agenda. So this is also the kind of the political process, and so we'll see who will be winning the elections. But this is very interesting because the civil platform, which is used to be in the power for 8 years and didn't really liberalize anything, and wasn't particularly supporting of LGBTQ rights or even women's rights. They are now speaking about supporting the access to abortion up to 12 weeks. So this is a major changer. Yeah. So maybe they are kind of trying to listen or see, or maybe they see the changes in the society, that this within this patchwork, this particular group is kind of growing and maybe it's stronger. So it may be the political game, but we'll see.
Well, I think to some extent this requires sociologists rather than international relations person. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about cultural fault lines? You'll find that cultural fault lines run through Western Europe, for example, and they're based, of course, on historical experience. You have to justify everything by reference back to your history and your identity as a people. If you try to divorce that, you're going to find yourself in trouble very, very quickly. So if you, from my point of view, which is international relations, when we looked at the disparity in support for the Kosovo War in 1999, it was very glaring. In the greatest support, around about 89%. It was a very popular Kosovo War in Western Europe, in some societies. In Norway, in Denmark, was around 89%. In France and England, it was 67%. In Spain and Italy, it was around 45%. In Greece, it was no higher than 33%. And people tried to explain why this cultural fault line. Some said it was Protestantism. It's a kind of the Protestants having this sense of wanting to save people, in case of Serbia, save people from themselves. I'm not in a position to explain why there were these distinctions or divisions, but they certainly existed. You have to be very careful because you can play with these games and they're not necessarily helpful. Robert Cooper, for example, a British diplomat who was the special advisor to Solano when he was high-level authority for foreign affairs in the European Union, came up with the idea that you could divide Europe into three. Postmodern Europe, which would be Britain, for example, not present-day Britain, but he was going back. A modern Europe and a pre-modern Europe. So the pre-modern would be catching up with the modern, and the modern would be... But this is the idea of catching up. And it's the idea of arriving at the future first, which is a very Enlightenment idea, by the way, that Europe as a whole had arrived at the future first. And we would have, what would we call Eastern Europe? Well, we certainly wouldn't have called it postmodern. We would have called it modern, but some East European countries are more modern than others, and some are certainly still pre-modern. If we're going to play those kind of games, we have to be very careful, I think, the terms in which we're arguing. So I'm a little skeptical of that, but I go back to your general proposition that history is the key here, I think. The great thing about history is you can interpret it or reinterpret it as much as you like. So it can actually prove anything. And that, I think, is the main thing, not to ignore it, but to reinterpret it, or in a kind of Nietzschean sense, to revalue it. Because as Nietzsche would have said, history is all you've got, basically, for your values. They all come from history. They haven't changed. Our values have not significantly changed in thousands of years. It's often said poor Nietzsche went mad trying to think of new values, but he couldn't. It was Rorty who actually said Nietzsche went mad because even he was not capable of coming up with new values. I don't think he was attempting to come up with new values. He was just showing that societies like the Soviet Union or Cambodia that talked about year zero and starting all over again are societies of decay and destruction. You don't renounce your past, you build upon it, and you revalue it. and discover in it. I mean, Bloch, I think, famously said, the past is never really over. You're constantly finding in the past the building blocks of the future.
Thank you very much. And it's time to give the floor to the audience. So all questions, comments, once again, comments disguised as questions are most welcome. Joanna.
Just because I wasn't able to hear properly, illiberal. But the first argument was that illiberal elites are actually fooling. Yeah. I'm not sure if this is. I would say that the kind of social liberalization of society started earlier, before these particular elites came into power. So we could see already certain trends, and also in the European the research. There is the survey, European Value Survey, which was already indicating that the polls that we are moving in our kind of support for certain values. So I think it was already somehow there. But I would agree with the argument that these illiberal elites probably actually pushing for the liberalization, because but I would understand it more in the. I'm not sure if I would explain it by the Polish nature, but maybe rather by the fact that where is the domination and power, there is always resistance. So in that way, we are, I guess, certain groups, and there are trends resisting this imposed domination.
Thank you. Any further questions? Mr. Ratti.
The Russian ideals. Well, indeed, what are Russian ideals? I go back to the first Russian philosopher, Pyotr Chadaev, in his first philosophical letter, 1825, who was a westernized Russia, identified very much with Western Europe. Peter the Great's attempt to bring Russia into the European community of nations. He was very Russian at the end of the day, because he said, "In this we will probably fail." So this gloom is very much part of Russian intellectual tradition. We will probably fail. However, it is our job to rescue the Western Europe from itself. It is our job perhaps to suffer and show Western Europe perhaps the error of its ways. This was a very Polish theme in the 18th and 19th centuries, the idea of the three big rebellions against Russia, which was the idea of catastrophism, I think Milosz called it, which found its apotheosis in the Polish uprising 44, which for Milosz said that, and did, I think, effectively destroy this catastrophic ideal in Polish intellectual society. But the Poles would suffer for mankind, that they would be crucified on the cross, that they would be the redeeming nation. But there is something ennobling in suffering. Very few people would believe there's in the West that there's much that is ennobling in suffering. And the Russians still do. And this is an ideal that is very, very strong now. You can see it in the debate. amongst Russian nationalists, people like, indeed, Alexander Dugin, for example. Not that he's very representative of that school, but you'll find it in others. What's coming out of Moscow at the moment is that sure, we're suffering because of the setbacks and the sanctions, but we can take suffering in a way that they can't. And we have a kind of historical destiny to suffer for mankind. That is an extraordinary throwback to thinking that has died in Western Europe. It is just simply not there. And it hasn't been there for a very long time, actually. So that would be one ideal, a very destructive ideal, a rather chastening one. The other ideal would be that we're still a Christian country. Now, it's very difficult, and in fairness to Putin, he has never, although he's very close to the Patriarch and to the Russian Orthodox Church, he is aware of the fact that only 50% of people who live in the Russian Federation are Christians. He's also aware of the fact that the fastest growing population is Muslim. He's also aware of the fact that the white population, if you want to call it white, population of Russia is going to decline, just as the white population of the United States is declining as a percentage of the population. So this has real problems, particularly for the Orthodox Church. However, he nonetheless stresses that we are the last Christian country in Europe. We're the ones who still believe in those values. So the Catholic Church in Poland would have difficulty, of course, accepting that. But this is an Orthodox, of course, it's not a Catholic argument. And the Christian values are the heteronormal family, certainly gays. Gays are seen as an abomination. I mean, he calls the European Union gay utopia, EU-topia. He says that it is de-Christianized, that the basis of European values, as the European Union understands those values, is un-Christian and perhaps even anti-Christian. So this would be an ideal to reconnect religion. And of course, in terms of the biological terms I was saying, there's a lot of support for this in Russia because Russians want to believe. Russians do want the church, many Russians. They do want orthodoxy in their life. It's also the only Russian soft power that there is. Somebody was asking me at lunch today, what is Russian soft power? Russian soft power is the language for those people who speak it outside Russia, which is the diaspora in the Baltic states and in Ukraine, of course. Russian soft power is the Orthodox Church. Russian soft power is, I've forgotten what the third element of Russian culture. Indeed, Russian soft power is Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but you will only find the French talk about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, which is why Macron is indeed sitting on the fence here, because for France, European civilization is impossible without the novels of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. Liz Truss does not think that European civilization, if she thinks that there is such a thing as European civilization, requires the novels of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. The French genuinely do. It's part of their social imaginary for Europe, strangely enough. Doesn't help in this particular crisis, unfortunately. Particularly when you read how Dostoevsky rejected when he came to Paris and London, was so shocked and horrified. Even Alexander Herzen, one of the great dissidents, turned out to be very Russian towards the very end of his life after living 20 years in France and coming to dislike the country and its culture for its lack of value, for its materialism, for its industrialism, for its science, the science which is the most materialistic thing of all as far as Herzen and others were concerned. So these are the kind of ideals. I'd say they're very 19th century ideals. I wouldn't say they were pre-modern ideals because Russia is a modern society and it's a perfectly functioning society and it does things very well, including science, mathematics, etc. Always has done those things. But it's not certainly not a postmodern society. And those ideals, I would say, to misuse the language, are modern ideals. They're not postmodern ideals. We really have left those ideals behind us. So that's my answer to your question. We're dealing with a different kind of beast. And I use the term beast, not in a pejorative sense, but a different kind of animal. Well, we can't use those ideals to construct anything ourselves. they would think that they can use those ideals to reconstruct the society that they think was destroyed, as Putin says, under communism, which he abominates, and by Westerners. The big argument in the Russian historical community now is between the Westerners and the Eurasianists. Those saying that the worst Tsar who ever lived was Peter the Great, because, as Spengler said, he used this term pseudomorphosis. Spengler said that Peter had tried to graft European civilization onto Russia, and it didn't take. It wasn't totally rejected. The body didn't completely reject it, but the body didn't like it particularly. And therefore, Russia was a broken back civilization, thanks to Peter the Great. And the Eurasianists go back beyond Ivan the Terrible. They go back to the Middle Ages. They say that Russia was founded really in the Middle Ages. This is in the 15th century, 14th century. This is where Russianness comes from. And these are Asian values as well, under the Mongols, for example, 400 years of their control. The Mongols, of course, allowed the church to grow, allowed the monasteries. The only thing the Mongols asked people to do was pay taxes. All the Russian words for taxation are Mongol words, because the Russians didn't pay taxes before the Mongols forced them to. But this debate between historians is fascinating. And all the Western historians are liberals, of course. And all the Eurasian historians are more authoritarian in their understanding. So Russia, I think, basically needs a Tsar. My last point here, sorry, I've talked for too long. It was a Soviet dissident, and it runs in the family because his son is now a Russian dissident, anti-Putin. But his father made this argument a long time ago that the problem with Russia was that it used to have a past pluperfect tense, but in the 15th century that disappeared for some reason. So nothing in Russian history ever comes to an end. Everything repeats itself, but because of history, in different forms, of course. So whether the Tsar is Ivan the Terrible or Stalin or Putin, there's always a Tsar. The Russian bear is always there, threatening its neighbors, but that bear takes different forms. There are always dissidents, usually intellectual dissidents, but they are dissenting against different things, different sets of ideas. And he says, we can't turn the page. We Russians are really anchored to our past, but it's a contested past, because we can't even agree on whether the Peter the Great was great. So there's no national narrative or historical narrative that holds Russia together. It's the narrative that the government, the ruling government, has adopted. And of course, Russian history books are constantly being changed to make sure that Russian school children learn one narrative about the history. That will be, of course, challenged in due course as well.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Yeah, please.
Well, I think if you look at the data, if you look at the polls, the public polls and so on, you could see already very much the change in the attitudes. Yeah, so there is a much bigger support now for the easier access to abortion after the ruling of the Constitutional Court. There is also the support for the rights for LGBTQ people. So at the level of the kind of social attitudes, people's attitudes, it is already changing. And going back to the question about the church, and biologically, our biological link to religion, well, I'm not sure if it would be challenging, this biological link, but again, data show in Poland that more and more people are kind of giving up, especially the trend is particularly strong among young people. There was this research a few years ago, Pew Center I forgot the full name of the organization which was doing this research. It was like a global research about the religiosity, and it turned out that actually among the young people, the drop in religiosity is the biggest in comparison to the older generation in Poland than in any other country. So European countries. So it shows, and the data which been collected recently, over the last few years, they definitely show that there is something happening in terms of Polish religiosity. The less and less people are declaring that they are religious, less and less people go to church, take part in the services. So I'm not saying that this is dramatic decline, but this is definitely something new, which has been observed since more or less 6-7 years. So so the question is if the church will still have, because we also need to distinguish between the kind of the political power of the church and the kind of church as a religion which can be supported by the believers. So the question is to what extent the church still will have the power if the political constellation changes. And this is an open question, because definitely what we observe, there is a kind of also resistant and challenging to the power of the church from the people, because I think lots of people are simply tired of these close links between the Polish politics and the Catholic Church. And there are lots of resemblance, I would say, with the argumentation which you were saying, the arguments which you were bringing about Russia and how they cooperate, how Putin is using the Orthodox Church. The mechanisms are very, very similar. The argumentations are also very similar. But of course, this is Roman Catholic Church in Poland, who's the right one, which saved us from everything. So.
Any more questions? Julia.
Well, I think it would be in line with what we were saying earlier, that this is part of the kind of social control, the control over sexuality, and also the sexual politics is a kind of implementation of the control over body of the others. So in that, I guess you could go along this argument that some who were investing in and for whom the idea of, for example, not engaging in the sex or is problematic, that they would like to maybe somehow control the lives of the others. But I would like to also stress that these abortion politics or sexual politics, which I referred to, they are bigger. They are part of the bigger, I would say, issue in Poland. Because they are very much linked also to the conservative thinking about, and this priority being given to the community and the right of the community to control the body, especially the body of the women. And there are also lots of research in this research on how anti-abortion discourse is constructed. There is also this differentiation between the good women, and this would be mothers, who ideally have sex only for procreation. Yeah, of course I'm exaggerating now, but generally, you know, the good wives and mothers who will be caring, will be also falling into or fulfilling this model of the right femininity, very much kind of, you know, functional for the sustaining national identity. And these other women who are very often considered occult feminists or, you know, promiscuous and so on, so on. So there is also in the argumentation about the abortion, there is this tendency to say that these other women, you know, they are a danger to the future of the nation, and they are also a danger to the right model of femininity, which should be promoted and which constitutes the kind of base for the social order. Yeah, so there are these dynamics somewhere there. Yeah.
Can I just add that in England, of course, we young people, I think, generally have sex later in life, and they don't drink or do drugs as much as my generation did. We came through the sexual revolution of the 1960s, for example, often called the New Puritans. Whether approvingly or disapprovingly, depending on your perspective. So even in Western Europe, I mean, there are changes, I think, towards sex, for example, when you should have it.
Mm-hmm. Any further questions?
Well, the Russian soul is a 19th century invention by Russians themselves who discovered it and have written about it ever since. The West bought into it. In the 19th century, it was very popular in Western Europe, particularly in France, to believe that the Russians were more soulful than these materialistic. This is the time of the Industrial Revolution, remember, and this hatred of the bourgeoisie that was in French intellectual circles throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, perhaps even still today. There is no Russian soul, of course. Societies don't have souls. And there's nothing intrinsic in DNA, either biological or I would say even cultural, for the Russians not to be able to change. But I don't see any prospects of change anytime soon, because I don't see the historical forces that would require that. And I see a social isolationism now that is growing. I've been going for years to something called School of Civic Administration. They're having anniversary, I think 25th anniversary in Berlin in December. And we began with these great meetings. Putin used to send congratulations to them. This was back in 2001 and 2002. They all came along to talk about how to liberalize Russia. And it never actually happened. And today they're a very, I should say, sorry bunch. Now I have to say that, even though I was on the board, because they're a very small group supported by the Council of Europe. And they meet outside Russia, of course, most recently in Stockholm, because they can't meet in Russia themselves. They're not allowed to travel anyway, so they're now emigres. They've gone mostly to the Baltic states, to Poland, to Germany, where the institution is incorporated. So it's very sad. But I do have to say that the very first time I went to one of their meetings, which was back in 1993, I think it was 1993, we were addressed by Gaidar, who was then the Prime Minister of Russia, who gave us a wonderful speech on how westernized Russia was going to become, liberalized, etc. All very, very interesting, and we were all very enthusiastic. And then somebody made a criticism about Russia, and he said, the problem with you Westerners is that you're so materialistic. The Russian people can put up with a degree of suffering that you simply can't, and we will suffer in order to achieve our goals. And so I sat next to George Walden, who was then, I think, had been a minister in Mrs. Thatcher's government, and I said, should we go off and have a look at the Russian soul this evening and see the degree of suffering that Russians can? So we did, and we went into this town called Golitsyn, and I've never seen a more depressing place in my life. I used to go to South Africa in the 80s and go to townships in Johannesburg, And places like that, the townships weren't as miserable as this particular place because, of course, you had the wonderful South African weather, you had the African character, which is always to make the best of a bad situation. Basically, optimistic people, not a pessimistic. The Russians are a pessimistic people. They've got a lot to be pessimistic about, historically. So, and we just couldn't find it. And we really did look at Gaidar in a completely new light. That you've had 250 years of Russian intellectuals, the intelligentsia, lying to themselves or lying to the Russian people about the virtues of suffering.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yeah, of course.
Because Christopher, you said something about, if I understood your argument well, you were saying that basically religion is kind of maybe, there in our genes, biologically somehow embedded. We are biologically kind of embedded to be religious. And then you mentioned that nationalism was supposed to replace religion, but it doesn't work anymore. And no one would die for their countries these days in Western Europe. And this was something very striking to me, especially in the context of Ukraine. I was wondering, if like 15 years ago, if we ask people in Ukraine, they would be saying they would be dying for Ukraine, and now they do. So the question is, if it's really what you were saying, this is about that nationalism is somehow fading away, and now we are having religion instead, and isn't it to in kind of line when we see this nationalistic mobilization, right-wing parties which are becoming successful on utilizing the nationalistic rhetoric and everything. So isn't it too optimistic?
No, I see where you're coming from. What I was saying in the 19th century was that nationalism became a kind of secular religion with its own saints and even idea of martyrdom and prophets, of course, founding fathers. And in the 20th century, in some societies, religion was replaced by political religions, like communism, like fascism, etc. And that in some societies, nationalism itself became a political religion. I always thought of Nazi Germany as being far more nationalist than fascist, by the way, National Socialism. You should take the term seriously. It was both socialistic in many of its aims and achievements, by the way, in terms of welfare, workers, trade unions, not trade union rights, but worker. It had a very good record here, better than FDR, by the way, in that respect. But it was also very, very nationalistic. And we don't have political religions any longer that I'm aware of. We don't have an ideological nationalism to the same extent. So it's much more populist, much more localized, I hope you know what I mean in that respect. And I don't think people would die for it. How many people would die for what the Polish government expects of its citizens when it's radically restructured Polish society? I very much doubt they would. I know that Slobodan Markovic will be talking about this in a few minutes' time, so I don't want to steal his thunder. He's also going to tell you that the West Europeans won't die for anything, including what they believe in, which I believe to be true from my observation and reading. So there we are. Is that an answer to your question? It's just because, let me just ask you the question. Yes, you put together a very interesting and I think very convincing argument that what the government wants is a nationalist Poland. How sacred is that nationalism? How many sacrifices would even party members make for that vision?
Well, I don't know, but I would be not surprised to see none, especially from the party members.
Always. The politicians never sacrifice.
No, but yeah, so of course, but this is maybe not for the party, but maybe for the defense of the church and, in the name of the suffering, which is somehow, running still in Poland very much, maybe, yeah. But.
When Hitler gave a speech back in 1935 or 1936, which is very revealing, he said what made the Aryan race, and of course he was talking about the Aryan race here, but by which he meant the German people, what made them distinctive from every other was their capacity for sacrifice and suffering. So his voters should have realized at that point that they were going to be asked to make sacrifices later along the line.
Mm-hmm. But my question was also kind of filled with this, because I don't know that, maybe it's obvious, but I wonder how many young people, and people more generally, were willing to die actually in the First World War, Second World War, really. Or to what extent they were just forced, or they were facing certain necessities, because this is, the will to die, and actually the kind of circumstances which may actually push you against your will. The question is also how many people in Ukraine, want to die now to defend their country.
Well, certainly in the First World War, I can only talk about the British here, but the British soldiers did believe in the cause and did believe in the war. That all the letters that were sent home, which were censored, of course, and read by the officers and others, they all expressed complete conviction, A, that their country was going to win, because their country always won, except against fellow Englishmen like the Americans. That was just a blip in British history. Secondly, that the cause was worth fighting. And that they didn't actually make many complaints about their situation, surprising though it may actually seem. And well until the late 1920s, if you look at the popular histories of their experience in the First World War, they were all very pro the war. The war had been a worthwhile thing. Yes, millions had died, our families, we've all got family members who never made it back, but it was fine. Things changed in the late 20s, partly because of the war poets and partly because the politicians themselves began to tell people that actually those sacrifices weren't really worth making. Look, the world has not been, we didn't make those homes fit for heroes, etc., etc. We promised you nirvana and we didn't deliver it. And then you see that the soldiers begin to change retrospectively, whether they thought it was meaningful or not, because the politicians who were supposed to tell them it was meaningful no longer were able to find the meaning in it. And one of the sad things, it seems to me, is that the last British soldiers who died went to their death thinking the whole thing had been a complete waste of time. From my historical perspective, the war had to be fought, and the right people won it. That's my historical perspective, not shared by all historians, but shared by many historians, by the way, in Britain. But you won't find many people today who are willing to accept that analysis from me. They'll just say, well, what are you talking about? Of course it was a waste of life.
Leon.
So I have a question for you. What's interesting about the politics of sexuality, abortion issues, LGBT issues, or anti-LGBT issues, some of those issues resonated with some of the Trump supporters. And of course, the Trump administration at the time would at least not admit too much that those were some of the core values of some of their supporters. And I think Ambassador Richard Grenell would probably also, I mean, he would sign with Trump and be the greatest thing for LGBT rights in the US. Compared to any other president before him. But then, so there was not that much engagement with regards to polling on those issues, at least not publicly that we know about at a grand scale. And then the Biden administration but sitting with a bit of a dilemma because of the hangover of the Trump administration, you now have this reversal of Roe versus Wade. So it doesn't give a lot of ability for Biden. It doesn't enable the Biden administration to lecture folk on issues of abortion. Right? So I guess that there's a bit of a problem there. But what are you hearing in terms of U.S. engagement currently on LGBT issues and on the abortion issues in relation to polling? One, and what's happening with other EU member states in terms of diplomatic engagement on those issues and the instruments that they're talking about using in challenging some of those issues.
Thank you for this question. So I think in terms of the involvement of the US, it wasn't definitely on the kind of political official level, but definitely, as I mentioned earlier, there were transnational links between the civil society organizations. So there are research showing how the idea circulated from the US, from the Christian right in the US to Poland, and this has been well documented already in the 90s, where the whole debate about the abortion politics starts. The very beginning, it was 1993 when the law, the so-called compromise, was basically passed. So if you follow the arguments and the links, even kind of the links between the organizations, you would definitely see that there was a cooperation between US and Poland, but mostly at the civil society organizations, I would say. There was financing, the transfer of money and ideas, basically. So in terms of the recent attempts, I don't think it was, as I said, I don't recall any kind of official standpoints of the American administration, but definitely, again, the cooperation with civil society organization. And when you said that Biden doesn't have the position now to teaching Poland about abortion, for example, actually teaching came from the EU mostly. There were, for example, the resolutions in European Parliament kind of, in a way disciplining Poland, or pointing that this is the valuation of human rights. For example, these LGBT ideology-free zones, that this is in fact the evaluation of human rights. And the same, there was also, for example, resolution regarding abortion. So the EU is actually the institution which is both gives itself, the EU, I mean, especially European Parliament, which gives itself a right to comment and to, for example, try to maybe put pressure on Poland by issuing the resolutions, but also so it would be definitely the European Parliament. You also,
Sorry, can I just
yeah,
add one small thing to make it a bit more complicated? We saw a lot of that prior to the February escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war.
yeah,
It sort of died down.
yes.
And it had to do with the fact that the role that Poland was playing.
Nothing
So what has happened since then?
since the beginning of the war. There wasn't much of the developments right now in terms of this field. There was, I think, for some time, for a few months after the war started, the Polish politics were also kind of reorienting itself, and there was even a moment of a kind of a national unity, you can say, that there was this kind of divisions within the politics, and the kind of fight between the government and the opposition was kind of kept on hold for some time. But I think we are now, so it was kind of exceptional time, but I think we are slowly getting back to that. And recently hasn't been any initiatives related to these issues, to the sexual politics. However, we have a new elections next year, and what was very striking recently, that Kaczyński, the leader of of Law and Justice, he started to actually use the to argue, or kind of to use transgender people as a kind of, try to construct the new security threat using the transgender people. So he was trying to, again, use a very similar, I would say, scheme to say that this is something which is endangering our way of life. This is a potential danger. This is what the EU is promoting, and we are here to actually protect and to sustain these well biologically defined gender roles. So we'll see what will be happening. The closer we get to the elections, because LGBT plus issue was particularly kind of strongly used for offering before the previous elections. So there was both in the presidential elections and parliamentary elections, there was the kind of homophobia very much promoted by the United Right. So we'll see what will be next. It seems, I was reading this, that Kaczyński found a new enemy in a way, because the data shows that lots of people actually support LGBTQ people rights. So there's maybe not much of the political fuel to use. So the question is, what will be next? So it was quiet for some time. And one more thing, you ask also about the other European countries. So, for example, when I mentioned about these LGBT ideology-free zones, they were enacted by many municipalities and towns on the eastern part of Poland. And what happened, for example, partner cities to these towns or partner towns were actually withdrawing cooperation in reaction to these sort of declarations, yeah. And there was also the threat that the money, for example, from a Norwegian funds won't be delivered to these particular towns and municipalities. So there was actually a structural pressure for these local governments to actually withdraw. And of course, there was also legal actions against that taken. So some of these cities, the courts were ruling that this is actually not in line with the Constitution and human rights. So it was also somehow combated in the legal terms as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Łukasz.
Well, one country in the world has given primates, the higher primates, rights now on the same level as human beings. Not just, it's not a right to life, but it's a kind of dignity as well. You can't experiment, use them, those kind of things. I forget which country it is now. New Zealand has actually given a right to a river because it's particularly important to marry community. Similar things will probably be happening in Canada, could be happening in Canada with native, they're not called Native American, but Second Nation. Is it called Second Nation in Canada? Whatever it is. So there's no end to this. It just shows the historicity of human rights. If you want to say this is a postmodern phenomenon, fine, but you don't have to bring that into the account. The first, by the way, the British government has a robots rights bill. It was introduced a couple of years ago. It doesn't actually mean very much because, of course, until robots get consciousness, what's the point of giving a machine your washing machine rights? But it all is, of course, involved with artificial intelligence. We still have difficulty understanding what artificial intelligence is or whether we'd recognize it if it was staring us in the face. But undoubtedly, the nearer we come to artificial intelligence, the more we will have to give those rights to those kind of sentient beings. So it's anything that has a consciousness that can feel pain. For example, the pain, not biological pain, but the pain of being switched off. You may remember that someone in Google quite recently said that they discovered that one of their computers was suffering from anxiety, that it could be switched off at any time. And then we were immediately told, he was dismissed, and we were told by the Google people, the people who run Google, that no such computer existed or could exist at the moment. And this was just a mistake on his part. He misinterpreted the data. But yeah, I mean, I suppose it does come to human rights is based, isn't it, on the concept of dignity. And perhaps we'll have to come up with some other formulation to explain why we give rights to other sentient beings, be they organic or inorganic, or non-organic, I should say.
Thank you. Perhaps the final question, if there is. If not, well, we are approaching just the scheduled time for this panel with just 2 panelists, which means that you must have been terribly exploited, for which I'm sorry, and you deserve a break. So thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. And it's time for a coffee break.